Good evening and welcome to Capital Connection, where we join the dots for the big picture of business in Africa. I'm Chris Bishop. On the agenda, we discuss the importance of intellectual property following International IP Day. How does good IP regulation facilitate a thriving creative economy? We then turn our gaze to the proliferation of corruption in a corporate world. Are shareholders not active enough? Speaking of investor activism, Boeing has come under fire from investors. Co-chief executive Dennis Muilenburg will face shareholders today for the first time since two fatal crashes of the Boeing 737s. But first, violent floods are lashing down on what is left of Mozambique. The aftermath of cyclone Kenneth, which was the second major cyclone to devastate the country in the last few weeks. Now, joining us more for the latest via Skype from Mozambique is Matt Carter, Communications Coordinator for the International Red Cross. Matt, just give us a picture of the last 24 hours. It's been widespread destruction as far as we can see from here.
Yes, indeed. Thanks for having me. So Cyclone Kenneth made landfall about 3 days or so ago now, and the winds caused massive destruction, particularly to the coastal area of the northernmost province of Mozambique. But in the last 24 hours, we've been inundated by rainfall here. We had flash floods in the city of Pemba, where I'm talking to you now from, and it's really hampered our ability to get aid and get assessment teams out to those remote communities that have been for the full force of Cyclone Kenneth.
How many people do you fear are affected in this latest cyclone?
I mean, it's hard to say at this stage. There are around 700,000 people at risk. Not everyone will be affected, obviously, but I mean, the fear is that the longer we leave things before getting out to reach people, the worse state they'll be in. There are many remote villages and communities in this part of the world that really will rely on the international aid to recover from the cyclone. In the short term, they need fresh water, they need shelter, and they'll need food in some instances as well. So it's really vital this next 48 hours that any weather window we have, we're able to push out aid into the field as quickly as possible.
And just give us an idea of the destruction that you can see. You've been moving around, obviously, Pemba in the north of Mozambique for some time over the last few days. Give us an idea of some of the destruction to property and infrastructure.
Pemba itself is, is a city. It's many of the major highways are waterlogged. You can see roofs have blown off in places, but it's really from the air over the villages in the northernmost part of Mozambique where you really see destruction. Some of the aerial shots from the UN over the last couple of days have actually been quite shocking in terms of the whole village is wiped out. Flood waters just where houses were. Yeah, it's a really big tragedy for certain villages in northern Mozambique.
And what's the feeling on the ground about how things are looking for the rest of the week, bearing in mind the terrible weather you're having right now as we speak?
I think you're asking about weather, and the forecast was for rain over the weekend. It's now Monday lunchtime, and the weather has eased off somewhat, so that it's no longer raining so heavily. Later in the week, we expect it to brighten up, and that will really give us a window to be able to go out, assess communities, and get aid via air and boats, and as well as roads to those vulnerable communities that have been cut off today.
Well, thank you very much there. Joining us from Pemba in northern Mozambique in the eye of Cyclone Kenneth is Matt Carter, Communications Director from the International Red Cross. Thank you very much. Now, in case you missed it, Friday was International Intellectual Property Rights Day. In the information age, intellectual property is hot property. Joining us to discuss the role of intellectual property in developing the continent is Coreen van der Merwe, the MD of the Sovereign Trust. It's probably a telling factor that probably a lot of people didn't know that it was International Intellectual Property Day on Friday. Doesn't that say perhaps people haven't quite caught on to it and its importance yet?
Yes, I think that's one area of the law that is extremely complicated, and maybe people try to not think about it too much because it is such a complicated area of the law. At Sovereign Trust, it's something that we deal with a lot of the time, and unfortunately, many of our clients come to us when it's almost very difficult or almost impossible to structure their intellectual property in a very tax-efficient way.
And how do you defend your intellectual property as a business? I mean, I remember people telling me stories that if you come up with an idea, you should mail it to yourself, registered mail, to protect that it was your idea in the first place. But in this day and age, what are the simplest ways that a businessman with an idea can protect his intellectual property?
I think we need to look at what is intellectual property, and it can generally be divided into 4 categories. So you've got copyright, you've got trade secrets, and you've got your trademarks, and then you've got patents. And then on top of that, there's a 5th element, which is the know-how. And once you've determined what are these elements in your company, you will be quite surprised as to how valuable that would be. But it starts with putting together a basic business plan and then identifying these 4 or 5 categories. And then you can add a value to that based on your business model. Certain aspects will obviously be more valuable than others. I think when it comes to IP development with regards to software, I think the know-how and how to use that is extremely valuable. In some instances, image rights that form part of trademarks are also very valuable if you're someone like a well-known rugby player or a cricket player. So it really very much depends on the nature of your business.
And who are out there? I mean, trying to take is it competitors in business or is it criminals?
I think it very much depends on the people the end users, whether they would like to be viewed as criminals or not. But I think there's so much intellectual property out there. It's not always someone with a criminal mind that comes and use your intellectual property. Yes, there are certain places, if you think of China, where there's definitely intellectual property being stolen and just using it. For them, it's quite normal business practice. But I think it's sometimes people that use your intellectual property that doesn't have that intention. And that doesn't make it right, though. And that's where it becomes very important that if you do have intellectual property in your place of jurisdiction where you have developed this IP, allows you to register it because that will give you the legal protection so that you can actually go and fight the use by a third party of your intellectual property. If it's not registered or you haven't recorded that ownership, you don't really have any foot to stand on.
Thank you very much for your time and insights. That was Coreen van der Merwe, the MD of the Sovereign Trust, on the thorny issue of how, as a business, to protect your intellectual property. Now to corporate matters. Now, the number of companies caught in corruption scandals has become many, to say the least, not just on the continent, but on a global scale. Is shareholder activism the key to keep corporates in check? Some say yes, some say it's a bit thin on the ground. But joining us to discuss the need to improve shareholder awareness is David Loxton, the CEO of Africa Forensics and Cyber. And that's the thought we go into this interview with. Are they too thin on the ground? It seems that the amount of people that we hear about, it's only the same people all the time. I mean, why is it people aren't stepping up at meetings and holding up their hands?
Yes, I mean, I think the underlying premise of my argument is that we're seeing shareholder pacifism. What we see is shareholders having a hands-off approach on the basis that as long as we're earning a profit, well, that's great. Let's just let the company continue. And what I'm saying is when we see how pervasive white-collar crime is in South Africa, surely shareholders should be doing a lot more than just the one name we hear all the time, which is Mr. Theo Botha. We need a couple of Theo Bothas on steroids, to actually start keeping our directors in check.
But you need an army of Theo Bothas at all the shareholders' meetings. People, yeah, you're right. Actually, people do ask questions, but it's usually about profits and revenue rather than the ethics and morals of the company. Surely, doesn't it occur to people that their investments are in danger if the company makes a wrong move?
I think it's a very sage comment, and especially if we see what's happened recently with shareholder wealth being decimated. One just looks at what the companies that have been in the news, the Steinoffs, the EOHs, of the world, where signal shareholders like Mr. Christo Visa have lost a small personal fortune. And one would have thought that would certainly give cause for people to say, hang on, I should be protecting my investment.
What is the problem, you think? Why aren't there more?
Well, I think there's a number of issues. One is that activism has a very negative connotation. It's seen as negative, it's seen as confrontational, and certainly on the African continent, I think that is one of the single most pervasive negatives towards shareholder activism is the Africans don't like confrontation, and especially in the investor community, which is small, relatively small. They need to deal with each other on a daily basis. Ergo, we don't see much activism because it's too confrontational and would lead to discontent, disharmony. In South Africa, I think there's a multitude of reasons as well. One is that our legislation is not promoting it. It certainly allows it, but isn't encouraging it. And I think we need to see more of our institutional shareholders doing a lot more. The coronations of the world who have, and the PICs, not just a single person like Mr. Theo Botha. We need to see a lot more of that. So in a long-winded way, what I'm saying is there's, to my mind, no real sort of legislative or legal reason for our shareholders to be taking their hands off approach.
But lastly, and just very briefly, if you're a shareholder and you phone up the CEO and say, listen, it's not the shareholders meeting, but I disagree with what you're investing in. I think it's going to damage the environment, and I'm going to get surely it's a good chance you're going to be dismissed. Yes. By the management. Isn't that a problem?
Well, if you look back at the history, that's exactly what happened to Mr. Botha. That's how he became an activist. He wrote a letter to a company in his personal capacity and felt he was fobbed off. And that's when he thought, well, I'm not going to be fobbed off. I'm going to now go to your AGM and I'm going to ask these questions in a public forum. So that's the kind of response one would like to see.
You think so? And how likely is it we are going to see it in the future?
Well, worldwide, activism is on the increase. The Harvard law reports and the Harvard journals have reported that there's been a big surge in shareholder activism in advanced economies.
Okay, we're likely to get many more lively shareholder meetings, hopefully, in the future in corporate Africa and South Africa. Thank you very much for your time and insights. That was David Loxton. He's the CEO at Africa Forensics and Cyber. Now, coming up after the break, now, Boeing is expected to address shareholders in Chicago today, but can the company recover from the reputation damage of its very tragic plane crash? For more, stay tuned. You're with Capital Connection and I'm Chris Bishop. Now we go to the story of air safety and air travel. Now, grounding the Boeing 737 MAX will cost airline companies hundreds of millions of dollars. The impact of two fatal crashes is a nightmare for Boeing. The company is facing numerous lawsuits and distrust for its aircraft from the flying public. Now, joining us to discuss the class action against Boeing, instituted by a Kenyan law firm on behalf of those who died in the Ethiopian air crash, is Chege Njoroge from Lesinko, Njoroge and Gathogo Advocates. And from Cape Town is Guy Leetche, editor of SA Flyer magazine, to discuss the Boeing's plan to deal with its dissatisfied shareholders and the flying public in general. Just to start off with, if I could come to you, Chege, and just tell us, when is the first or the next court appearance going to be for the families of the Boeing 737 crash?
I should mention that these cases, we've only filed one case on behalf of one family here in Kenya, but there are also others online. And I should be clear that these cases are not being fought here in Kenya. Our firm has partnered with US-based law firms to file cases in the US District Court of Chicago. So what has happened so far, we filed a complaint, and what we expect to happen is the discovery and inspection process. This is a form process by which parties table their documents before the court, So in the case of Boeing, we expect them to table document relating to development of the 737 MAX and other documents concerning the safety of this airline in line with the demands that will be made on behalf of our clients. Relating to how soon this is going to happen, so far this cannot be determined, but we expect the trial process to begin not nearer than 6 months or so, because there's a lot that has to be done before the trial process, in assuming that we get there.
Now we go over to Guy Leetche, the editor of SA Flyer magazine in Cape Town. What about Boeing? I mean, we mentioned the word nightmare in the intro. What is Boeing trying to do to deal with this terrible situation that everyone's facing?
Yeah, Chris, indeed, this is the question. There's two problems for Boeing. The first is the actual cost of the two crashes themselves. A rough estimate would suggest that they're in for about $1 billion on that lot, given that there have been about 348 lives lost, plus the two airframes themselves. And obviously, to a large extent, the insurers will cover that. But the real cost then for Boeing remains the cost of the grounding of the fleet of the 370 or so Boeing 737 MAXs, which have already been delivered and which are now sitting idly on the ground. Plus, there's the huge knock-on cost of the production of these aircraft, and especially in terms of their commitments to the suppliers, the component suppliers. Boeing is ramping up production to build deliver as many as 57 Boeing 737 MAXs every month. And obviously these two crashes or the grounding has put that production schedule far behind. So the costs are very large indeed, and it looks like they're going to remain on the ground for at least another month, if not more.
And the question I have is that what about the shareholders as well? I mean, they must be jumping up and down at the moment, just fearing for the very future of one of the world's best-known companies.
Indeed, we all know that Boeing is indeed one of the most highly valued brands in the world. It needs to be pointed out, though, that the 737 MAX disaster is not that big a disaster for Boeing. Yes, I believe at peak it wiped off as much as $25 billion off the corporation's market cap. However, Boeing is an enormously broad and diversified company with massive defense contracts and a massive space aspect to the business as well, and numerous other associated businesses. And really the market is looking down the road, expecting that the 737 MAX will be back in production and be back in the air within a couple of months. So I think the market is now looking through these as temporary problems.
So if I can go back now to Chege Njoroge, the lawyer in Nairobi in Kenya. Now, there's a lot of talk about how much this whole terrible situation is going to cost Boeing, but obviously the families of the people who perished, they've lost more than money can ever buy. But it's going to be a very expensive case, surely, to fight through the courts, this class action.
Yes, that is true. But what I should probably say is that our biggest interest in this case is to know exactly what happened. We believe that our clients are owed answers by Boeing. Seeing that this accident happened after another accident took place in Indonesia. So beyond any compensation that the jury in the US may be minded to give by way of compensation to the families, we want to have answers, and that's why the process of discovery is very important. Yes.
And my question again, follow-up is,
in terms of cost,
who is going to foot the bill for this court case? Who is going to pay for this court case?
Well, the way the cases are done, they are going to be done on a contingency basis, and this is the industry practice in the United States, so that we accept meeting the cost related to facilitation and documentation in Kenya. We will not be required, or our clients will not be required to do the bills until the case is settled. that's how it is done. I think just practically for cases of this nature, personal injury cases. Yeah.
If I just come back to you now, Guy Leetche in Cape Town, editor of SA Flyer magazine. What do you think? You've been reading about this class action against Boeing. It's certainly a groundbreaking one in Africa. What do you think is the chances? What do you think the chances are of success?
Oh, they have to be quite good. I'm almost unprecedented in the history of airlines and aircraft crashes and indeed airline manufacturers as well, is that Boeing's Dennis Muilenburg has pretty much admitted that they were at fault, or that Boeing did fail in this particular example. So I think that admission goes a long way to making the class action suit relatively winnable. Yeah, there are other finer aspects to the whole discussion. The question has not really been satisfactorily answered as to whether the pilots had indeed been properly trained or were indeed good enough to handle what was a mistake or a problem with the aircraft systems that had been successfully handled in a number of other cases. So I think that there will be some potential for pushback by Boeing, but certainly at this stage we're seeing a large element of mea culpa from Boeing, and also, interestingly enough, from the Federal Aviation Administration, the key regulator in this context, in having essentially acknowledged that a possible shortcut or two was taken in terms of the certification of the aircraft and pushing it into service before it was properly known, and without really making clear the implications of the new system and its lack of fail-safe alternatives to the operators of the aircraft, specifically the pilots.
Okay, well, if I could go back to Chege Njoroge in Nairobi. Been a lot of talk about this class action, but what exactly are you hoping? What's the best hope to come out of this particular court case?
This is at two levels. Number one, see, this is a second tragedy. We want to have a very clear assurance that this case does not only achieve for the victim, but for the safety of everyone, global travel, because it has been mentioned by the other guests. It's not usual to have to kind of happening so close to one another and involving some kind of plane and the circumstances which are so similar. So at first level, we hope that by filing these cases and by doing very lengthy discovery processes, it will be possible to know exactly what happened, and then steps can be taken to ensure that the safety of airline for all. Then number two, we think it's not possible, obviously, to bring back a life answer, but at least there has to be some kind of a compensation to the families affected. But we would not want to mention figures on this show for obvious reasons.
So back to you, Guy, in Cape Town. Where do you think, how groundbreaking do you think this court case could be, the hearing of it, and where do you think the future of the relationship between the passengers and the airlines in Africa in the future is going?
Well, those are quite two different questions. The first is that, I don't think it's true to say that a class action like this is really all that unique or new. There have been similar class actions relating to other airliners with fundamental faults, most noticeably the DC-10s, which had that problem with the baggage bay door blowing off, and there were at least 3 accidents associated with that. And a number of other problems with airlines. In the jet age, they really began with the Comet, which had those explosive decompressions because they didn't understand pressurization. So it's not relatively new. Where is it going for the people involved? Well, for all passengers involved, it's absolutely essential that Boeing manages to restore confidence in its products. And that means that I think that we will see an enormous amount of public relations activity going down with, for instance, the CEO, Dennis Muhlenberg, flying his family and his children on Boeing 737s, perhaps on a round-the-world flight, has been mooted to demonstrate the latest aircraft with the latest software and indeed hardware improvements to the various airlines and the regulators concerned. Who knows, there's been suggestions from President Donald Trump that they even rebrand the airline, the 737 MAX. I think it's also true to say that this may cause Boeing to reevaluate its long-term new model plans. It's currently focusing on a NMA, a new middle of the market aircraft, which would be somewhat larger than the 737. But now I think there's increasing pressure on Boeing to perhaps start with a new clean sheet, narrow body design to replace the 737 entirely.
Well, thank you very much, Guy Leetche, the editor of SA Flyer magazine, speaking to us from Cape Town, and also it was Chege Njoroge from Lesinko, Njoroge and Gathogo advocates, the people who are leading the class action against Boeing in the wake of the crash there. And that's where we leave it here on Capital Connection. Thank you to all my guests on tonight's edition. Join us again every Monday and Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. CAT. And from me, Chris Bishop, it's goodbye.